Today's event is taking place as part of post-colonial ecologies organized by دار الفنون, the Khalid Shuman Foundation. I'm going to give a brief intro about the project before moving on to TJ and Karim, whom we are very pleased to have with us this evening. Thank you, Karim and TJ, for being here. Unfolding through multiple exhibitions and online residency, public program, and summer academy, Post-Colonial Ecologies discusses and reflects on essential ecological questions, addressing how colonial practices and extractive economies have affected, contaminated the natural environments of indigenous peoples and native ecosystems. Departing from the epistemic violence enacted through dominant technologies of measurement and calculation that subdue life forms to market logic, the exhibition project unearths indigenous knowledge systems rooted in conceptions of nature and land as sources of life and subsistence. Thinking with Fennon, participants are invited to engage in critical readings of decolonization and to speculate on life futures that acknowledge land as the most essential value, its humus at once a carrier of collective memory, trauma, and a site of anti-colonial resurgence and regeneration. Against a modern grammar of predation and extraction, the multifaceted program invokes other worlds in the making, exploring radical forms of social organization that center mutual aid and more than human collaboration. The talk is part of the World Building in the Wake monthly series curated by Karim Stefan within the context of the Post-Colonial Ecologies exhibition project. Karim Stefan is a writer, editor, art critic, teacher, and PhD candidate in modern culture and media at Brown University, researching the poetics of witnessing and world building in Palestinian visual culture. Stefan is currently a fellow at Dar al-Funun. We can now move on to Karim, who will be telling us more about world building in the wake and introducing our guest TJ Demos before we start with the lecture. Thank you, Karim. You can go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Shud, and thank you to all the team at Darat al-Fanoon for hosting TJ Demos and this program once again. So welcome everyone to the second event in the program World Building in the Wake, which features artists, writers, and scholars who are imagining and building worlds beyond the colonial and capitalist systems that have endangered the diversity of forms of life on this planet. I'm very glad to welcome art historian TJ Demos, whose penetrating and prolific writing on visual culture, climate change, and economies of dispossession has been a major influence for me. I'll introduce him in a moment, but first, just a couple of announcements about this series. So for those of you who attended Nadia Speti's talk on Arab science fiction and world making last month, she has kindly prepared a reading list of sources that she referred to in both Arabic and English, and you can now find that on the Darat al-Fanoon page for her talk, together with the full video of her talk if you missed some or all of it. And next in the series, after TJ Demos, next month will be Viviane Sansour, creator of the Palestine Heirloom Seed Library. She will be speaking on Tuesday, May 18th, so please stay tuned for that. Today, I'm very excited to host TJ Demos, professor of art history and visual culture at University of California, Santa Cruz, and founding director of its Center for Creative Ecologies. He researches the intersection of visual culture, radical politics, and political ecology, particularly where they oppose racial and colonial capitalism, and is the author of several books, including Beyond the World's End, Arts of Living at the Crossing, out last year on Duke University Press, Decolonizing Nature, Contemporary Art and Political Ecology, Sternberg Press, 2016, and Against the Anthropocene, Visual Culture and Environment Today, Sternberg 2017. I'll add that I first encountered TJ's writing in his excellent 2013 book, The Migrant Image, The Art and Politics of Documentary During Global Crisis. And those of us in or from the region may know him best for his very insightful writing on artists including Emily Jasser, Ahlam Shibli, Irene Anastas, and Renee Gabri, and the Lebanese post-war generation of artists. I feel personally indebted to that book for my own research, as he introduced, importantly, Edouard Glissant's concept of the right to opacity, to thinking about poetic and indeterminate images of Palestine in his sharp analysis of the Odalith group's refusals to identify and explain the suffering in the Jenin camp in their essay film Nervous Rerum. But TJ's ability to write incisively across cultural and political contexts is especially impressive, and he has examined artistic and activist practices from Brazil to India, from Uganda to Finland. Most recently, TJ co-edited the Routledge Companion on Contemporary Art, Visual Culture, and Climate Change, just out this year, and directed the Mellon-funded Sawyer Seminar research project Beyond the End of the World, which includes an ongoing public lecture series. He is presently working on a new book on radical futurisms. TJ will be speaking today about the key questions and arguments that animate his book Beyond the World's End. He has said that he's particularly interested in opening today's event up to conversation, so I'll ask him a couple questions after he finishes speaking, and we'll leave plenty of time for public Q&A afterwards. Welcome, TJ.
Hey, thanks, Kareem, and thanks, Jude. It's great to be here. Thanks to everyone that Darat al-Fanoon for the invitation. It's an honor to speak, and very excited about learning more about the exhibition Post-Colonial Ecologies that I understand will be going up in September. So I look forward to that, as well as the rest of the lecture series. So yeah, thanks for that very generous introduction. And I'm going to be presenting, as Kareem said, some discussion around my recent book project. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And so my presentation should be about 25 minutes. And then I look forward to the discussion. So, okay, we are entering the end game, the terminal point of democracy, of liberalism, of capitalism, of a cool planet, of the Anthropocene, of the world as we know it. Catastrophic environmental breakdown, global pandemic, neo-colonial extractivism, algorithmic governance, racial capitalism, anti-migration populism, and endless war comprise some of the forces structuring this conjuncture. Given the socio-ecological crisis, informed by past colonial genocides, ongoing corporate ecocides, and transatlantic slavery, how do we conceptualize the aftermath? What of the many worlds that have already ended? Equally urgent, how do we represent the radical potentiality of the not yet? How do we cultivate and bring into being emancipated futures? Addressing this urgent, multifarious, and world historical subject, my recent book, Beyond the World's End, centers interlinked socio-political, economic, and environmental crises, a copious and rousing intersection capable of motivating and engaging interdisciplinary, comparative research and civic attention alike. Doing so, it focuses specifically on models of aesthetic practice, where life is being reinvented in ways that not only critically identify the manifold problems that threaten existence as we know it, they also offer diverse approaches to a hopeful futurity, where hope joins speculative imagination to the material practice of living otherwise, capable of carrying us beyond the end of the world. Extending over 7 interlinked chapters, my inquiry addresses the visionary video projects of John Akamfra, in particular his piece Vertigo Sea, and Arthur Jafa, especially his Love is the Message is Death, each of which, but in very singular ways, expansively reconceives what climate means, drawing the term into inextricable relation with socio-cultural ecologies of racial capitalism, slavery and its legacy, as well as current migration politics and mass species extinction narratives. Both experiment with the visuality of world-ending disasters in racial and more than human terms, conjoining biopolitics to geopower. Linking what some call the blue humanities to the Black Atlantic, I consider Akamfra's video in relation to the sea's industrialization and militarization, threatening its sublime non-human alterity, as well as its Black liquidity, it as a graveyard of slavery's wake, and present migration and its mass grave. Jafa's work comes up in chapter 6, discussed in terms of solar apocalypse, Afrofuturism 2.0, and the monstrosity of racialized violence, all posed against the dangerous white futurisms of geoengineering and the neoliberal Anthropocene. Jafa and Akamfra each also glimpse emancipatory futures beyond the catastrophe of capitalism's ecology and its deathly inhuman and racial objectifications, and proposing sites also of necessary solidarity. My second chapter relatedly builds on that basis, addressing extraction as a fundamental logic of our ruling economic order, connecting resource mining to the governmentality of debt, unequal trade agreements to neo-colonial financial domination, as diversely plotted in the video-based and sculptural projects of Angela Melitopoulos, Alora and Calzadia, and Ursula Biman. These variously investigate conflict geographies in such places as Greece, Puerto Rico, Canada's tar sands, and Bangladesh's Ganges Brahmaputra Delta, revealing what Achille Mbembe terms the becoming Black of the world, a complex proposition of precarious globalization, or the globalization of precarity, on which I elaborate as, alternatively, a newly racializing logic of climate injustice and a crepuscular aesthetics of post-colonial liberation. To Mbembe's diagnosis of this new norm of precarious and defutured existence, I would add the material exposure to extraction's waste zones, its befouled elements, its colonized atmospheres, its toxic externalities, and public health emergencies, where becoming Black, in lowercase to connote its more than racial character, is evidenced in urban pollution, in degraded water, mismanaged waste, and indebted and diseased bodies, even though this negativity does not totally define the category either. While its zones may be expanding globally, exposure is still based on differential vulnerabilities and unequal resources of protection, with the interconnected relations between the two inspiring further cycles of commodification, targeting healthcare, education, and housing, as much as the primary elements of water, air, and soil, each encountering ongoing cycles of privatization and extraction. And this is happening worldwide. Over several chapters, I consider the visual politics of climate refugees, a controversial and potentially objectionable term, especially for those who fall unwittingly into its embrace as depoliticized objects of humanitarian rescue. As appearing in the anthropological work of the Argos Collective and in popular photojournalism, these migrant images often cloak the structural forces behind dislocating inequalities that would indict Western complicity, doing so by disguising them with media spectacles, familiar photography of faces, and empathic personal interest narratives, as in the work also of Ai Weiwei, which I look at in this chapter as well. Against those tendencies, my third chapter highlights an experimental media visuality of causes and creative beyonds, as materialized in the work of practitioners like Audrey Quinn and Jackie Roche, forensic oceanography, and Teddy Cruz and Fona Foreman. In chapter 6, my analysis resists any flattening dissolve into a regressive anti-technological green, while it also equally rejects any simplistic futurist accelerationism. It does so both by inquiring into how justice itself defines a social technology of sorts, and by opening my research to the considerations of eco-media and computer games as virtual sites of the progressive practice of political ecology, namely those of Public Studio, which is a Toronto-based collaboration of Elle Flanders and Tamira Sawatsky. Midway through the book, in chapter 5, I address the animal cosmopolitics, conceptualized in the experimental artwork of Laura Gustafson and Terika Hapoya, which integrates post-anthropocentric politics and aesthetics in their proposed rebuilding of legal and cultural institutions, offering a radical socio-political composition for a world to come. This discussion extends the book's earlier material insofar as it builds upon its focus on racial exclusions and social violence by exploring ecologies of the more than human within an intersectionalist framework, which importantly links intrahuman exploitation and dehumanization with environmental destruction and non-human animal objectifications. In my last chapter, I attend to the sociocultural modes of non-extractive living, where organic agriculture merges with radical politics as an artistic form of life, as well as a life of creative forms, human and non. Here I also extend the discussion of cosmopolitics to creative areas of socio-ecological transition in actually existing artistic activist mobilizations, including Standing Rock's No Dapple, or the indigenous struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline, and also the international movement for institutional liberation from petrocapitalism, as much as more generally from privatized toxic philanthropy and racial and colonial capitalism. And also I look at Europe's largest autonomous zone and post-capitalist ecological experiment known as the ZOD, emergent worlds all, each embedded in the depredations of the current dominant spread of global capital, every one growing out of the traditions of the oppressed. So what is a world, given this preliminary overview of my book? While no simple or even complex answer suffices, my understanding begins by calling up an infinite assemblage of discursive representations and deep genealogies of meaning-making practices, audiovisual narrations, and literary constructions embedded in and shaping cultures supplement all manners of knowing and being, forming lifeways established over generations. These surely contribute to and emerge out of violent conflicts with other competitive worldings, some systematizing and domineering, each comprising geopolitical cosmologies, heterogeneous modes of habitation, collective forms of belonging, and structuring forces of temporalization. All imbue the world, however great or small, ultimately uncapturable in totality, with formative values and expansive significance. With Christian Parenti, I consider what he terms a world-ending, catastrophic convergence of climate breakdown, expansive militarism, and growing impoverishment, making for a socio-ecological cataclysm to come. Isabel Stengers, too, reads a coming barbarism in our cards, where dominant capitalist political forces at a time of threatening post-democracy and even fascist creep instrumentalize the very threat of the end of the world to support their own financial interests, including techno-fixes that do nothing to address and even worsen socioeconomic inequalities, anti-migrant xenophobia, and indeed demand further military interventions from the sector that is in fact the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. It's clear we're in the midst of a world historical, cosmological event, an event that's quickly making the world we once knew historical. I consider it as a great politico-ontological unraveling that challenges the limits of knowledge itself. My thinking, aided by Deborah Danowski and Eduardo Viveros de Castro's recent study, The Ends of the World. In it, they observe how geology is converging with planetary mortality, such that we're about to enter, or have already entered, the uncertainty itself being an evidence of runaway temporality, a regime of the Earth system that is quite unlike anything we have ever known. The near future becomes unpredictable, they write, if not indeed unimaginable outside the framework of science fiction or messianic eschatologies. Time itself is endangered as much as the imagination. Their point recalls Amitav Ghosh's notion of the great derangement. His book title, referring not only to the current disruptions of Earth's natural systems and their temporalities regulated by seasons, but also to the systemic inability of still dominant Holocene modes of cultural production to represent those disruptions. These latter owe to now outmoded stylistic conventions reliant on stable environments, playing the role of secure backgrounds to human-focused storytelling. Modern fiction has thus failed to capture the extreme events and climate weirding of the Anthropocene emergence. Just why that is, Ghosh suggests, is, in his words, perhaps the most important question ever to confront culture in the broadest sense. For let us make no mistake, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of the imagination. While I agree that this question is indeed urgent, my book takes a different tack. If we look more closely and more specifically at experimental forms of contemporary art and visual culture, rather than limit our gaze to what Ghosh calls serious fiction, then we can see that cultural practices are indeed dealing with climate breakdown, including the endings of worlds and the inaugurations of new ones in all sorts of imaginative and inspiring ways. Those practices are also undergoing radical transformation in doing so, which have possibly rendered them somewhat illegible, at least to conventional institutions of exhibition and art historical analysis. But if we look more closely, we can observe that in fact the most compelling examples of contemporary cultural production offer an acute lens on this expansive cosmopolitical event, as well as a creative laboratory of world making, not least of which involves the reconfiguring of the ultimate end as both termination and emancipatory goal of art at this critical stage of history. At least that's what I argue. Current fears of the world's end are thus importantly contextualized by indigenous voices that view them as a mode of settler anxiety, the anxiety of those implicated in settler colonialism, haunted by those centuries-old histories of colonial violence, climate changing brutality, and genocide-directed militarism, forces that have long disrupted fragile ecologies integral to native life worlds and continue to do so in the present. Indeed, indigenous peoples have already lived through many such apocalypses about these complex historical entwinements of worlds and ends, including the Anthropocenes. Zoe Todd importantly asks, in her words, what does it mean to have a reciprocal discourse on catastrophic end times and apocalyptic environmental change in a place where, over the last 500 years, indigenous people faced and face the end of worlds with the violent incursion of colonial ideologies and actions? What does it mean to hold in simultaneous tension stories of the Anthropocene in the past, present, and future? She asks. Her answer, with which I agree, is to insist on seeing Anthropocene stories of multiple temporalities and geographies, of sequential world-ending events as a progression of ruins that informs present anxieties and realities, a progression indissociable from current climate breakdown. We must think the multiple ends of multiple worlds somehow together in a comprehensive analysis that will best enable us to address current and future challenges. My approach rethinks political ecology as much as aesthetic practice in light of the great rift of climate breakdown and its world-ending events. The first step is to develop what I term ecology as intersectionality, necessary to overcome the various iterations of nature-culture binaries and oftentimes reductive framings of ecology as present in the diverse articulations of green capitalism, of techno-scientific rationality, and environmental art history. I adopted as well to challenge the anthropocentrism that often curtails social justice and anti-racist politics in theory. Emerging out of Black feminism and African-American jurisprudence and their rejection of the artificial but institutionalized segregation of racism and sexism. Intersectionality has brought focus to what Patricia Hill Collins terms a matrix of oppressions, which equally demands interlinking comprehensive redress via entanglements of justice demands. While Marxist critiques of capitalism have importantly integrated ecological considerations within their methodologies, for instance, in their dialectical materialist approaches to past and present understandings of the metabolic rift between Earth systems and social reproduction under the long history of capitalism, there's little sustained discussion therein of the formations of racial and colonial oppressions, even while Black and Indigenous decolonial studies have pointed out substantial limitations in the former's, that is Marxism's, class-centered priorities. At the same time, while mainstream environmentalisms, for example, that of Extinction Rebellion, or 350.org, or MoveOn.org, or Greenpeace, or Sierra Club, does important work addressing environmental justice concerns related to climate breakdown's disproportionate impacts on and exacerbating vulnerabilities, particularly within communities of color. There's often minimal intersectionalist thinking in their relentless focus on greenhouse gas emissions and atmospheric carbon. To conceive of climate as anti-Blackness or socioecology as anti-racist resistance is to make a major intervention within mainstream environmental discourse, refusing ecologies of affluence and their disciplinary specialization and rejecting the perpetuation of colorblind environmentalisms, as when its definition is institutionally and conceptually restricted to non-human natures. One example of this is the UK-based organization, Wretched of the Earth, that's written some really useful critiques of mainstream environmentalism, including that of Extinction Rebellion. I find these insights crucial on several counts, especially if we are to avoid perpetuating the false idealism of locating nature beyond, instead of firmly within culture, politics, and technology. And certainly some Anthropocene conceptualizations do important work here in avoiding such binaries. I find that the theoretical political insights of people like Christina Sharp, Stefano Harney, and Fred Moten are essential in mobilizing an intersectionalist language in order to resist those nature-culture divisions, to insist on structural critiques that link intrahuman, racial, sexual, ethnic, discriminatory violence with wider environmental destruction, and to expand climatological conditions to such factors as psychoaffective weather, jurisgenerative atmospheres, and aesthetic environmental materializations, some of which have been naturalized over time and which all require sensitive analysis and critical scrutiny. These conceptual mutations of ecology, I argue, parallel contemporary transformations of art as advanced by the practitioners considered here into sites of expanded creativity, unbounded by commercial institutions that tend to discipline and manage its products as distinctive luxury commodities for wealthy clienteles, defining an increasingly outmoded form of cultural practice. Equally, my approach to aesthetic practice is distinct from models of eco-critical art history that inadvertently turn ecology into a thematic concern, often celebrating exclusively its non-human realms, picturing and materializing ecology, and thereby containing its radical relationality within the artistic frame. The result effectively discounts the transformative event of climate breakdown, contributing to institutional normalization, and disregards art's more ambitious interventions within socioecologies of racial capitalism extraction. In my reading, art defines the experimental practice of world building, generative of justice-based cultural values, and creative thinking and feeling places of radical sensibility. Its practice includes speculative and critical knowledge creation, situated within or allied with communities of action and social movements, and always, most ambitiously, provoking and furthering an entanglement of insights, perceptions, and affects. In other words, these are what I have termed creative ecologies, practices that make new sensible materializations and connections, aesthetic, practical, juris-generative, between otherwise discrete realms of experience and knowledge, and that cultivate just worlds to come. With artists and media practitioners, musicians, and diverse accomplices working at contributing to these current world wars, we encounter some of the most meaningful rift zones in Anthropocene times. It's in these cosmopolitical rift zones that a future world of many worlds has already begun to emerge. So I'll stop there. And, thanks very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, TJ, for such a rich talk and wonderful overview of so many facets of your book. So I have a lot that I can ask, as do, I imagine, many other people here. I think I want to start with the question of futurity in a way. You mention a more hopeful futurity that is brought about by practices of living otherwise, creative practices, social practices, and of course you showed us creative practices that exist outside of art institutions, importantly, and are engaged in ongoing struggles, whether they're against an oil pipeline or protecting a kind of autonomous zone. And you also at a different moment mentioned Arthur Jeffa's work in contradistinction to geoengineering and sort of corporate top-down models of what an optimistic, in their view, future would look like. In your book, you use the term conflictual futurism there. I was wondering if you could speak more to how a hopeful futurity to you is also conflictual, and what that means in terms of moving forward to living otherwise.
Thanks, Kareem. Yeah, that's a great question and opens up a lot of material, including things that I'm thinking about in relationship to my current book project, which is dealing with what I'm calling radical futurisms. So I think we're at a time when we're confronting the fact that our future has effectively been colonized, and lots of people have been writing about this and thinking about it over the last, even few decades, starting with someone like Frederick Jameson. There's Bifo, there's Mark Fisher, lots of different figures, including indigenous thinkers who are already arguing that we're living in a post-apocalyptic, or at least some of us, or some of them, are living in a post-apocalyptic time where the future has effectively been colonized and debilitated. So the challenge currently is how to reinvent forms of temporality that recover some claim on the future, some claim against being defutured in relationship to this conflict of futurities. And this taps into the conditions of an increasingly technogenic futurity of capitalism. In terms of, for instance, I'm looking at a lot of like algorithmic AI and neural net types of approaches to predictive futurity, where, you know, again, lots of people are writing about this, but this notion that that somehow the future itself can be subjected to risk analysis in order to eliminate contingency, so that we can move into a future of probability instead of one of risk and uncertainty. You know, this is outlining the conditions in which capitalism basically, as a structure, as an event, is imagining itself into a kind of infinite post-historicity, where there's no possibility of any disruption to its continuity over time. And certainly, you know, I'm based within the shadow of Silicon Valley here in Santa Cruz. There's immense amounts of resources that are going into this in relationship to challenging the conditions of catastrophe that we're looking at also at the same time in relationship to climate breakdown. And so not surprisingly, these forces are attempting to come up with technologies of climate control that function not only in terms of potential ways of mitigating climate disaster or capturing atmospheric carbon, but also, most importantly, guaranteeing the continuity of their own political and economic models. So geoengineering is one that I've been looking at and considering in relationship to the book and elsewhere, where I see this kind of battle or this world war, this war over what kind of world we want to live in, taking place. Not that that was Arthur Jafa's aim at all. I don't think it was, but this video, Love is the Message is Death, amazingly taps into this and offers ways I found that were incredibly generative to think about what's happening in relationship to futurity, specifically between Afrofuturism and the kinds of priorities that are developed within that kind of approach to temporalization compared to the technogenic futurity of geoengineering. And the difference is simply, you know, it's with Silicon Valley, with geoengineering, we're looking at an extremely narrowly defined environmentalism, which is extremely technocratic, it's anti-democratic. It's a matter of corporate-led developed nations research programs to mitigate the worst effects of climate change, versus an Afrofuturism that prioritizes social justice, racial justice, economic justice. So I think the challenge today is how can we mobilize one to abolish the other before we enter into increasingly into this world of exterminism and the defuturing of whole peoples. So for me, sorry, this is a bit of a long-winded answer, but it was a big question. In terms of what a hopeful futurity is here, there's lots of different approaches to hope itself. Many critical, many seeing hope as something that's escapist or politically debilitating, or other ways of conceiving it that are more critical and embodied. And it's those latter that I find really essential in terms of thinking about hope as a material practice. Hope is not something you just, you escape to and just speculate about. It's something that actually carries material implications. And it's necessarily social. It's connected to social movement struggle. I like this way of phrasing or defining hope as Isabel Stengers comes up with, which is hope makes the difference between probability and possibility. I like that very much. I think that's a way that we can mobilize hope as a material practice within social movement struggle in order to contest the colonization of our future.
Thank you. Yeah, so many important threads in what you said there. And before addressing a couple of them, I just want to say for those watching, there's the Q&A section. You can feel free, please, to ask any questions that you have for TJ, and we will get to them shortly. For now, I think, what you said about the fight against colonizing the future is very important. And also, to root that as you have in indigenous thought, in Afrofuturist thought. I mean, as you spoke about colonizing time, I was thinking back to Kojo Ashun's essay, Further Considerations on Afrofuturism, where he's already warning, that the future is a kind of part of the R&D department of major corporations in terms of predicting futures that are probable in order that they police the other possibilities to profit from those probable futures. And I think, there are more and more scholars addressing this problem. I think also about Amy Bong's wonderful book, Migrant Futures, where she's talking about futures that are on the move beyond what speculative capitalism tries to pin down. So I wanted to ask you about how you're conceiving time a little bit more broadly here. You mentioned that, the imagination of time is under threat. And I think you have a lot of distinct, sharp phrases about what time we're in a way. We're in the wake, as many Black studies scholars would say, from Christina Sharp to Saidiya Hartman writing about the afterlife. We're also preserving a kind of yet to come as we are after the end of world for many, but also what you say in the subtitle to your book, At the Crossing. And then there's also the question, of course, of periodizing and naming something like the Anthropocene. So I guess it's a question about how to narrate what time we are in and what we're moving through, and how that narration of our present affects how we get to that kind of hopeful, embodied, critical, hopeful future that you were just talking about.
Yeah, thanks again for that. I think for me, and at least in this book project, it's really a research engagement that's thinking alongside and with cultural practitioners and those who are making artwork, those who are engaging in world building practices that might not be recognized as artwork per se or limited to that category, as well as all the curriculum of theoretical, speculative insights into the conditions that I think help us better comprehend this world historical conjuncture that we find ourselves in now. So in terms of how to narrate it, the book is broken down into chapters where I'm looking closely at different practices, and that's how I'm choosing to narrate. That's my methodology as a study of current practices. That I'm also making the case, and as part of my argument, that this adds up to something, and it helps us understand ways that we might narrate what's happening right now that attempts to address the greatest urgencies and provide the best kinds of political and also aesthetic lessons in terms of how we might approach this and think about it. So that's important. And there are stakes in the book in terms of considering competing narrations and challenging those that I find problematic or inadequate in different ways. So, for instance, I mentioned in my brief presentation the work of Amitav Ghosh, who's really interesting Indian American writer who has also written about in this book The Great Derangement, a nonfiction approach to in a way, narrating this environmental situation that we find ourselves in now, and making some claims about how cultural practice fits into it that I ultimately object to and want to see it differently, especially from the lens of more of a multimedia types of aesthetic engagements, whereas he's looking quite specifically at what he calls serious fiction. So that's an example of you know, a narratological conflict or challenge that the book makes, or intervention that it's attempting to propose. But you know, it's something. What I'd like to do, what I find in some ways most interesting, is to really, you know, do a deep dive into the interpretive understanding of artworks, and thinking along with them in terms of, you know, what they're proposing, what are they doing, what new insights are they opening up, how can we narrate, what kind of stories are they telling, and how can we add to this and build on it, where the, you know, over several studies, the momentum builds up into something that reaches into making large-scale claims, even if it's not ultimately, and it's not by any means, a comprehensive analysis.
Great, thanks. And we have some audience questions coming in that are quite interesting, so I'm going to start asking from the audience. This is an anonymous question. Could you say more about a hopeful vision of art's potentialities to cultivate worlds to come? And I'm particularly interested in how this optimism might rest on an expansion of what is considered artistic practice and what the role of art history may be in this endeavor.
Sure. I think, you know, part of what I'm trying to argue is that in terms of the challenge of what we have to overcome in order to define the conditions of a hopeful futurity, and that also inspire not only the analysis, but also the comprehension of our present conjuncture, as well as the forms of practice that necessarily have to take place. I think this has, I've become, I think, increasingly, you know, confident that this ultimately has to do with challenging the conditions of racial and colonial capitalism. And that itself is not something that you always find, or find at all often within artistic practices. And certainly I'm not making any claim here that one should do this or that. It's what I find most interesting and challenging. So I think that is especially the challenge. Like, how can art in the widest sense of the term, in other words, not as an institutionalized category of legibility, or a commodifiable market object that can be placed on exhibition, but art is an aesthetic practice that is reconfiguring how we understand and what kind of desires inspire the world in which we are living in, and what kind of world we want to be living in. Like, this is really the most, I think, more of an ambitious understanding of what art can be. So how can we look there for new kinds of conceptualizations, new kinds of inspirational ways of representing, or new kinds of forms of practice that open up our imagination in ways that are radical, ultimately. Radical in the sense that they propose and enact a disruption of the fundamental conditions of racial and colonial capitalism in terms of how they structure, in so many ways, our complete existence, right? So that itself is the challenge, and it's on that basis that we can develop forms of hopeful futurity. How do we do that? Where do we find these practices? You know, in a way, my work as a proposal, as a conceptual, or even to some degree, a disciplinarily based proposition, is attempting to make an argument. Look, it's in these practices where we can see some of this. We can see the necessary disruptions taking place that could provide a kind of glimpse of the crossing that we need to make from that world of disaster and catastrophism toward a hopeful future of social justice and environmental multi-species flourishing, even if we don't know completely what that will be, because that's an important element of the hopefulness of futurity itself. That futurity, if it's going to be hopeful, it can't be completely defined. It can't be totalized in advance, because we're coming from a positionality that's very much structured within this incredibly oppressive framework, again, of racial and colonial capitalism. So the hopefulness of futurity itself on a speculative basis has to include within itself a not yet that is open-ended and undeterminable. I find like that itself is really interesting to see how that gets conceptualized and represented or entered into aesthetic form within different practices. And here, one of the leading examples for me has been the work of the Autolith group, which is, you know, Kojo, as Kareem mentioned, has long been thinking about these questions in different ways. And I find that their work is attempting to pose these very ambitious and expansive kinds of inquiries that help us think about how to operate in these conditions.
Thanks. So this is a follow-up question that's similar from the audience. So I'm going to highlight a couple parts of it based on your last answer. So Roshin Taponi asks, how can we go about achieving hopeful futures of social justice in capitalist ruins? So I want to ask you to just emphasize this. Who is the we also that you envision here? Is there a kind of coalition that is thought of in creative and social practices countering racial and colonial capitalism? Does it emerge from a particular site? Yeah, so the question from the audience, and also if you want to think about the we a little bit here.
Yeah, thank you. Another really useful and important question. The we that I'm thinking of is the we that emerges out of the traditions of the oppressed. Basically out of the conditions of racial and colonial capitalism, of those who have suffered the worst from it, and also those who are willing and committed to joining them in a struggle on the basis of solidarity, on the basis of a kind of multiracial solidarity that defines a politics that is attempting to challenge those conditions. The conditions of white supremacy, the conditions of the continuity of colonialism, the afterlives of the oppressive conditions of the afterlives of slavery. That itself forms, and for me, I would argue, I think this is a major political challenge of the moment. But this forms a new collective emergence of opposition to these conditions that is itself the basis of a new kind of politics. And that's the one that we most need today, I think. There's no singular way to contribute to that. We have to each do so from our distinctive positionalities and where we find ourselves. I would never argue that there's one kind of artistic approach either. There's infinite ways to contribute to this, but I think it's worth keeping in mind, like, how can we develop forms of practice? How can we develop forms of life that are that offer prefigurative spaces that bring this type of existence into being? How can we realize it in the now? How can we demand this currently? And this would go along with the specific formations of decolonization, And here I'm thinking of, I'm based in the US, so I'm thinking of projects like the Red Nation and some of their recent work, which is an indigenous, decolonial political collectivization and movement formation based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or the kinds of abolition politics in the States and internationally that correlate, I think, in many ways with anti-colonial struggles worldwide and draw on histories of anti-colonial and decolonial projects that have long been in existence. So how can we contribute to and build a we within that basis of opposition? And that also entails then a disidentification from the conditions of neoliberalism, the conditions of white supremacy, the conditions of capitalist exploitation. I think those are the kind of practices that I'm really interested in tracing and writing about, and also amplifying. And whether that happens in art history or not is I don't know. It's an open-ended question. Art history, in my experience, I think tends to be quite conservative and isn't really often interested in asking these kind of questions. As a discipline, it's quite enclosed with lots of institutional pressure that polices the boundaries of what discourse can be. And I found that quite frustrating. So increasingly, I think more broadly, visual culture, or looking at aesthetic practices in ways that are interdisciplinary or post-disciplinary, are most compelling.
And this question follows up on you speaking about distinct positionalities in a way in your last question. So Anonymous asks, I'm curious about your own positionality as a white man who is using ideas, strategies, and knowledge from mostly Indigenous, Black, and POC creatives and thinkers to formulate your arguments in this book, albeit in an illuminating manner.
Yeah, it's important to think about and ask that kind of question. So in terms of my own positionality, I'm a second and third generation white settler within the US context, growing up according to a cisgendered heteropatriarchal formation. And what can we do but recognize, identify, and disidentify, ultimately challenge and oppose the oppressive structures that lead to that kind of positionality. So this requires a kind of commitment on the basis of one's politics to a politics of liberation or emancipation that includes the resistance of one's own privileges and inheritances. So, people like Fanon talk about being a race traitor. I think this is really crucial, or a class traitor. I think we have to, those of us who are installed within these conditions and have been raised within them, have to do a lot of questioning in order to participate within what I think is most important to develop now, which is this kind of multiracial solidarity against racial and colonial capitalism. That means addressing the challenges of certain formations of identity politics that all too often operate in order to divide us and create forms of separatism, as if those who are only of this or that identity can speak about this or that in terms of a political formation. I found books like Assad Haider's Mistaken Identity to be really interesting and useful here in terms of offering an important critical basis on which to think about a different approach to politics than that provided by identity politics, or at least returning to certain really important and often unrecognized origins of identity politics, like in the Combahee River Collective, which was a queer Black feminist collective operating in the 1970s, that was arguing that we find our identity in politics itself. We don't find our politics in our identity. So this is a clear and basic distinction. And I think what they're arguing is that it's crucial for Black women to organize and enter into alliance with those who do not look like them, who are not them, or who don't share their identity. I think this is the challenge today. Another way of thinking about this is through a kind of insurgent universality. This is another term that has been, rightfully criticized for decades now. Universality as a mode of neo-colonialism or kind of imperial formation that hides the universalization of a particular identity, generally kind of white male, educated, class-based position. But how can we rethink universality itself so that it's insurgent, so that it's happening on the basis of an altogether different kind of politics? Someone like Max Tumba, Judith Butler, others are thinking about this, and I think this is really important to reconsider, to argue for the basis of a new kind of politics that can challenge the false universal claims of capitalism itself.
And this also follows on that track from Maysoon Sukaria. I have a question related to the intersection, so to speak, of decolonize, capitalism, and climate change activism. Decolonize has been dominated by identity politics, while, as you mentioned, there is a clear intersectionality not only between climate change and capitalism, but also colonialism. So how can art bring in anti-capitalism and climate change to the decolonize movement? Can it do so? I'll just say decolonize is capitalized here. I'm not sure if it's, decoloniality, decolonize this place, the collective, but you can choose to interpret it or differentiate it however you want. Yeah.
Well, that's what my book is partly about, which is to challenge the segregation, let's say, within discourses and within artistic practices, where in many ways, in terms of conventional approaches to art and its histories, the environmental arts have very little to do with decolonization, with social justice, with anti-racism, with abolition. And that has a long history. If you look at environmentalism itself historically, within many parts of the world, environmentalism occurred at a moment where capitalist industrialization was becoming aware that it was rapidly exhausting its natural resource base. So if you look at deforestation in terms of logging for industrial purposes in different parts of the world, it's exactly within those locations, from India to the US, that you have the earliest formations of a conservation movement. But if you look closely at the conservation movements themselves, they're strongly entangled with colonial politics. And so, for instance, in the US, conservation was part of the colonial project, so that in establishing national parks, protected ecological zones, that those were premised upon indigenous dispossession, removing indigenous people, often in the most brutal ways, as part of a genocide, ultimately, from those lands. And so conservation as an environmentalism from the earliest moments was wrapped up in a colonial project.
Looks like TJ's connection is frozen. Hopefully he will return shortly. I'll contact him. I hope that we can get him back in a moment. I guess in the meantime, while we're waiting for there's TJ. Wonderful.
Hi, sorry about that. I guess I was cut off somehow.
No problem. Yeah, continue. You were speaking to, I think, the different geographic contexts of conservation and conservation itself as a kind of settler colonial project, genocidal project.
Yeah. So this continues on into the present, and when we hear from mainstream climate environmentalism that the biggest challenge of the so-called climate emergency is decarbonization, that's continuing this this narrow way of defining what environmental practice should be, and that you see echoes of this within artistic practices in the way the arts of environmentalism sometimes take form. Not always, and it's not always intentional, but often you see these partitions or these ways of categorizing that I find are problematic, are like reminiscent of a single issue type of politics. They silo our concerns in ways that itself is a kind of act of epistemic violence, I think. So part of this book is to try to challenge those partitionings, and equally, I try to point out equally within, for instance, anti-racist politics. Often there's no thinking about ecological concerns or challenges to anthropocentrism. So how can we bring these together? Again, there's lots of practitioners who are doing that. And I deal with this only a selection of the expansive possibilities that exist today. But I think this is what the book is about: to try to focus on these practices and provide some methodological contributions to how we can think about ecology as intersectionality in terms of an intersectionalist aesthetic engagement.
Thanks. Yeah, and I was also thinking, as you spoke about the national parks in the US, about in Palestine, how, say, cultivating and picking akub has been outlawed by the state of Israel on the basis of conservation, right? So that the indigenous tending to the land, including picking, long-picked vegetables, is suddenly seen as against environmental protection, a kind of, settler anxiety, essentially, about transforming a landscape that becomes an excuse for further dispossession. So we have one last question from the audience here. This is anonymous. I would be curious to hear your thoughts about the role of arts in negotiating truth beyond the end of the world. And perhaps hear if this must also entail a different form of negotiation between the social sciences and the so-called natural sciences. You mentioned the problematics of looking at nature beyond culture, and I find that a very potent point. But does this not also risk subjecting nature to human-centric discourse?
Karim, could you read that last part again?
Sure. You mentioned the problematics of looking at nature beyond culture, I guess, outside of culture. And I find that a very potent point. Does this also not risk subjecting nature to human-centric discourse?
Yeah, I don't think so. It can. And to some degree, we're always entrapped within our own epistemologies. This reminds me of a kind of question about like the possibilities of an object-oriented ontology or speculative realism. This kind of thinking might come up. I don't think it has to be that way. I think it is possible, and I think scientists are providing one way of doing this, of developing modes of observation that are generating truths about the world that also are aware of the impacts or the consequences of observation itself, of human observation itself, that don't, however, end up producing an anthropocentric construct out of the results of that observation. So I think there is, even though we're well aware of our impacts, including even at the level of scientific observation within, for instance, quantum field theory. That's what I'm thinking of in relationship to, for instance, the work of my colleague Karen Barad. That doesn't mean that we can't know about a realm that is non-human and autonomous in its own ontology. And I think that this is a really important thing. There's a recent essay, by the way, by Nancy Fraser called "Climates of Capital" that was published just recently in New Left Review that looks at different natures and argues for there's proposals like Jason Moore in his book, Capitalism in the Web of Life, who argues that capitalism has brought about what he calls a double internality, a double internalization of capitalism in nature and nature in capitalism. And this resonates in many ways with Anthropocene research, that it's no longer possible to separate the human and the natural. Well, people can take this to extremes that are themselves, I think, I would agree, indefensible. Like when Jason Moore, I'm sorry, when Timothy Morton proposes that we can think ecology without nature, this is getting us, I think this is getting ourselves into a kind of conceptual quagmire that ultimately he does not escape from, and ends up producing something that is just extremely problematic and unconvincing, ultimately. Well, Nancy Fraser's essay is a useful corrective to that, as is Karen Barad's, which is to say, no, nature has not become solely a product of human conceptualization or determination, for that matter. There still is a realm outside of the human that continues to operate within functional ecosystems, even if they're increasingly hard pressed. So that kind of primary nature that's nonetheless still evolving. It's not a realm of ideal forms or anything like that. But I find Fraser's analysis really helpful there in terms of ways to describe that are not simply anthropocentric. This is complex thinking. This is kind of staying with the trouble that we need to do, rather than to avoid simple binaries or simple modes of categorization. In terms of the question of truth, I mean, I feel that really opens things up probably in ways that necessarily exceed the framework of this talk. But I think I'll try to bring it together just quickly, which is that if you look at a practice like Black quantum futurism, this is a collective based in Philadelphia in the States. They're trying to bring together Afro-diasporic thought and traditions, including in relationship to time and history, and connect them to some of the recent insights of quantum field theory, and challenge some of the conventions of a post-Newtonian system of truth, including in relationship to time and space. I think what they're doing is really fascinating in terms of articulating the conditions of what a truth of, say, a just future would be. And it would be a truth that would be grounded, again, in conditions of colonial and racial capitalism. It would be a truth that would be necessarily connected to those conditions, that would be articulating as well a vision of liberation on that basis. And that would be something that would be necessarily, it would be world building, it would be necessarily interdisciplinary, it would include the sciences, but sciences for the people, rather than sciences for corporations and government, militarism, extractivism, and like big pharma. You know, like that's the kind of truth that I would be interested in, a truth that is dedicated to meeting the needs of people rather than the profits of the few. It would be a truth that would be structured within those political conditions of liberation and emancipation, rather than one that is, you know, instrumentalized or siloed within the conditions that are dominant today. Sorry, I don't know if that answers it, but there's obviously a lot to think about there.
Yeah, no, that was a great answer. There are still questions pouring in, but we do need to wrap up fairly soon. If it sounds okay to you, maybe I'll ask two that are out there at once, and you can just choose to answer what you want of it briefly. Okay, so Amna Muzaffar asks, thinking about art's ability to metabolize the present conditions of life and the residue of history, I'm wondering if you can speak more to a practical and pedagogical guide to developing hope as a material practice in continual tension with dread as material practice. And an anonymous attendee asks, I'd like to know if you have any thoughts to share on how to create emancipatory practices based on resistance to the many power dynamics you've mentioned, while also entangled in those very power structures, which give meanings to our subjectivities, to our understandings of the self and our relationship to others. How to be or how to think otherwise while entangled within those ontological and epistemological groundings?
Sure. In terms of the first question, which was about how do we consider modes of practice that are not only attempting to cultivate forms of hope, but also recognize conditions of dread. I think, you know, Black quantum futurism is another good example of this that I'll mention. And you can check out their website, and they have lots of books and texts and videos that you can check out. But they're clearly, this is a group that's dealing with conditions of racial terror and the long legacy of slavery and its aftermath in relationship to the dread of police violence and brutality and forms of, you know, of environmental injustice, of housing injustice, of just the current condition of what makes up racial capitalism in the US right now. And what's so amazing about their practice, from my perspective, is they're interrogating those conditions and refusing to surrender to them. And they're figuring out ways to develop modes of agency within those conditions that are highly speculative in terms of their artistic and also musical imagination, because the musician Moormother is part of Black quantum futurism. So really interesting, like sonic politics. So it's conceptual, it's theoretical in relationship to quantum theory, speculative, coming out of Afrofuturism, out of literary and music traditions. But it's also grounded in that materialist practice of hope. So one of the members of Black Quantum Futurism is Rashida Phillips, who's actually a housing justice lawyer. So when they talk about like spatiotemporal agency, in terms of escaping from the ghettos of a colonized future, right? They're also working on the ground in relationship to housing justice and dealing with the history of redlining, all of these legalistic real estate practices that have subjected African-American communities for a long time to conditions of slum housing and forms of indebtedness within racialized impoverishment. And we could talk lots more about what this means and how they do this in terms of their community grassroots practice. But I think you get the sense of what I'm trying to get at. What I find interesting here, they're bringing together an expansive theoretical conceptualization of spatial and temporal agency with actual embodied nuts and bolts practices about how to help people who are living in this condition and struggling against housing injustice within those circumstances in Philadelphia today. So I think that's a great example of a practice of resistance that also responds to the second question. In terms of my own work, I think something that helps for me increasingly that is urgent in terms of a form of resistance is to avoid the kinds of individuated artistic, cultural, and academic practices that neoliberal capitalism increasingly imposes upon us. And so for me, based in Santa Cruz, I've found it really increasingly important to be involved in social movements. That for me happens to be, within my context, what's most vibrant and politically engaging here is the Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA, which is a social movement. It's the largest socialist organization in the States that's also struggling against these conditions within the center, in many ways, of empire, of the military industrial complex, of the most extractive and exploitative forms of capitalism. So for me, that's how that is really helpful to escape the risks of being solely a kind of speculative, individuated practitioner operating within the neoliberal university or the many institutions of the art world that I intersect with. I think it's really important to have a grounding within a structure of comradeship dedicated to common, collective, multiracial, working class-based struggle against these forces. So that I think is really important. And we have lots of different activities that are attempting to, that specify our engagements, that make it very concrete. For instance, we're also struggling for housing justice and a kind of anti-eco-fascist sensibility that is increasingly, it seems, taking over in the States, but also internationally in some ways. So how can we challenge these conditions? How can we fight for a red deal? How can we struggle for a radical Green New Deal? These are some of the questions we're asking that are very concrete and get us into policy and also activist practice.
Thank you so much, TJ. Those are such generous, thorough, sharp answers to very big questions, and really appreciate both your talk and all of your answers to these public questions. I also want to thank Serene Hulele for doing a tremendous job translating live into Arabic, and to all of the Darat al-Fanoon curatorial team, and to everyone in attendance. Thank you so much, and look forward to welcoming you all for the next talk as part of World Building in the Wake.
Thanks again, Kareem, and also thanks to the translators. I hope I didn't talk too fast, but they were really great questions, and I really enjoyed thinking along with you. So thank you again for the invitation. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.